Hello there, welcome back to Jennie Designs with Paper and this week's episode of Crime and Coloring, where we take an alphabetical journey through the United States and revisit some of the earliest crimes. Before we talk crime, let's talk coloring. I have a collection of things from my stash here. I have my Simon Says stamp Intense Black ink. I have the W+9 Dexa Halls. I have a piece of Nina Solar White 80-pound cardstock, and I am going to actually stamp an entire card front today and do the most of the coloring. I want to use this deck sentiment with the sub-sentiment The Halls, and I am going to also be using the Strand of Lights multiple times and coloring them in multiple colors. I have a 4-color combination for each of the colors that I use. I will be coloring outside of the stamped lines because light bulbs glow. Their light does not stay in their little glass bulb. You'll probably see my head too many times as I try to line up the stamps that I am using. But hey, at least my hair's clean because I washed it today. Alrighty then, now that we've talked about our coloring, let's talk about our crime. The next stop on our alphabetical journey is the great state of Michigan. On January 26, 1837, Michigan was officially admitted as the 26th state in the Union. A skirmish with Ohio, known as the Toledo War, delayed Michigan's statehood and led to a trade. Toledo remained in Ohio while the Upper Peninsula became part of Michigan. Today, Michigan is the only state in the nation comprised of 2 peninsulas. Michigan has more miles of freshwater shoreline than any other state in the nation, about 3,000 miles to be exact. Michigan has the only authentic Dutch windmill operating in the United States. There are no longer any living Wolverines in the Wolverine state. The first air-conditioned car was manufactured in 1939 by Detroit's Packard Motor Car Company. Thank you for that. Detroit residents were the first in the nation to have phone numbers. And last but not least, Michigan is home to an interesting but unsolved family massacre. Our story today is a shortish one, but that does not mean it is not a good one, especially if you like mysteries. There is not a lot of background information on our family. In fact, I could not find any information on Anna from before her marriage. So let's jump into it. Jacob D. Crouch was born in 1809, no month or day listed, in Orange County, New York, to Henry and Susan Crouch. Henry had been in the military. He served in the War of 1812, and he was listed as the rank of captain. Jacob, however, moved from New York to Michigan in 1830, where land records show that he purchased land on 3 separate occasions in 1837. The first was 140 acres, the second was 40 acres, and the third was 40 acres. Then Jacob married Anna Bush on March 25, 1838 in Washtenaw County, Michigan. And I probably butchered that, sorry. Jacob and Anna had 5 children starting in 1839 with Susan, followed by Ethel in 1840, Byron in 1842, Dayton in 1846, and Eunice in 1850, and Judd in 1859. Anna died in 1859, 6 days after the birth of their youngest son, Jude. Jude was then raised by his sister Susan and her husband Daniel Holcomb on their nearby farm, and he thought that they were his parents until he was 10 years old. Against their father's wishes, Dayton and Byron, who were both Civil War veterans, moved to Texas to raise sheep, where Dayton died mysteriously in 1882. Eunice, Jacob's undisputed favorite child, was a graduate of St. Mary's College at Notre Dame. She married Henry White. Married for just 2 years, the Whites were living with Jacob so Eunice could care for her aging father. The Crouch family was known as kind of a strange family, and there were so many bizarre events that added to the mystery surrounding this family massacre. However, when Jacob arrived in Jackson County from New York State, he settled on a Horton Road farm that was known as a choice wheat-raising land. Some accounts said that Jacob was a millionaire with 1,000 acres of land, valuable herd of cattle, and property and livestock in Texas. Most accounts said that he was ornery, tight-fisted, and untrusting of banks and lawyers. And just so we're tracking, $1 million in 1883 would be nearly $30 million today. So, just in case you're wondering. 74-year-old Jacob Crouch, his daughter Eunice White, who was 8 months pregnant, her husband Henry White, Moses Polly, a Pennsylvania cattle buyer, George Bowles, a 16-year-old farmhand, and Julia Reese, a domestic servant, were all living in the unpretentious, if not shabby, Crouch farmhouse. Now, it sounds a little cliche, but it really was a dark and stormy night when Jackson County, Michigan's most famous unsolved murder occurred. There we go. Get that out there. High winds and a rare thunderstorm raged outside about midnight, November 22nd, 1883, hiding the sounds of gunshots that ripped through a Spring Arbor township farmhouse. Whew. George Bowles said he was awakened in the night by thunder and thought he saw a man with a lantern standing outside. He said he heard what sounded like a blow, then another, and finally a muffled scream. So he climbed into a trunk and stayed there until morning. When he went downstairs, he saw the carnage. He ran to the nearest neighbor, who summoned the sheriff. Jacob had been shot in the head. Moses was shot in the head and the chest. Henry had a bullet hole in his neck and another in the abdomen. Eunice took 2 shots to the right arm, one in the neck and another in the head. Before the sheriff could arrive, neighbors had burst through the door of the Crouch home, startling Julia, who was in the kitchen preparing breakfast and oblivious to what had happened in the home. Because they were the only 2 left alive in the house, Julia and George were jailed for the murders, but soon were released due to lack of evidence. The mystery surrounding who did commit the murders grew, and speculation was a sport. Some thought gypsies robbed the home, or that Moses Polly, known for bragging about how much money he carried, was followed from the train to the farm by thieves. Others thought it might have been the revenge of a farmhand Jacob had fired, but that list of suspects was long. Some said Jacob was planning to leave his entire fortune to Eunice's unborn child and cut Judd and his sister and her husband out of his will. Others said Byron, Jacob's son, had hired a band of Texas cowboys to kill his father to resolve a family dispute over the inheritance. The second child of Jacob and Anna died as a child. That's why she's not mentioned in this story again. Judd and Daniel Holcomb were charged with the murders on March 8th of 1884, and the story became more intriguing after more deaths involving family members. Susan Holcomb, Judd's sister and Daniel's wife, was found dead in her bed January 2nd, 1884. Some say she was forced to eat rat poison. Others say she killed herself because she didn't want to testify against her husband, but the coroner said her heart just gave out. 2 days after that, James Foy, the Holcomb's farmhand, was found shot in the head. It was reported that Foy talked too freely about the Crouch murders in local saloons and had even shot a Union City man who claimed that Foy was connected to the case. Foy's death was ruled a suicide. Now, Daniel Holcomb's trial started November 8th, 1884, so almost a year. The prosecutor was Frank Hewlett, and his health was very poor, so he called on Austin Blair, who was the former governor, to serve as special counsel, and then he died a few days into the trial. So good thing he had somebody else taking care of things. There were 145 witnesses called to testify, and they all offered only circumstantial evidence. No one could positively say who fired the shots that killed Jacob the Whites and Moses Polly. On January 10th, 1885, the jury returned with a verdict of not guilty after deliberating about an hour. Judd Crouch was never brought to trial, and no one was ever arrested or charged in the case. But you know me, that's not all I have to say about this. There are some really odd and interesting things that happened in conjunction with this case. The Jackson County Sheriff called an Ann Arbor photographer to photograph Eunice White's eyes to see if the image of her killer was still reflected in them. So that's kind of cool for the 1830s. The photographer said he tried, the photographer said he tried, but too much time had passed for it to work. Thousands of curious seekers, we would now call them rubberneckers, visited the Crouch farm. The Michigan Central Railroad reportedly halted trains at the farm to accommodate those who wanted to see the scene of the crime. Jackson County officials offered a $10,000 reward and a White family relative another $2,000 reward, leading for information to the capture of the killer or killers. The county also employed the famous Pinkerton Detective Agency to help. Dozens of amateur detectives descended on Jackson after news spread of the murders. Daniel Holcomb's brother Henry donned a disguise so he could hang out in the seedier parts of Jackson in an attempt to get information. Another amateur detective and former policeman from Battle Creek was shot in the chest while walking from the Crouch home to Horton, another town. He survived and said that Judd Crouch was the shooter, but that was never proven. Joseph Allen, a former Jackson machinist, was arrested in Hamilton, Ontario, and charged with the murders on the testimony of Henry Holcomb. His brother was dead, or had been charged previously, He had mortgages, deeds, land patents, and a letter that belonged to Jacob Crouch. However, the charges were dismissed on May 6, 1884, when Joseph said the papers had been given to him by Henry, the person who said he did it. I don't know. Mrs. Thomas Murphy of Jackson was one of the 145 witnesses called in the trial of Daniel Holcomb. She was killed by her insane, axe-wielding husband in the middle of the trial. In 1886, 3 bloody shirts were found buried in a stump of a tree on the Holcomb property. It was never proven they belonged to the killers. Okay, dude, you've got 3 bloody shirts that are hiding in the stump of a tree. That's suspicious. I'm just going to leave that there. That's suspicious. Judd Crouch eventually moved to Indiana, but then returned to Jackson County, Michigan, quietly in the early 1900s and made a living hauling scrap and doing landscaping, and he died there in 1946. Eunice and Henry White are buried in St. John's Catholic Cemetery there in Jackson. Susan Holcomb is buried near her parents in Spring Arbor Township. And after being acquitted of the murder, Daniel Holcomb remarried Amanda Crouch and moved with her to Baraboo, Wisconsin, and that's where he's buried. Now, Amanda has got to be a relative, I guess. Couldn't find any information on her. Same last name, same spelling. George Bowles moved to southern Ohio and became a minister. Jacob Crouch's farm, estimated to have been worth $50,000, went to Judd, who later lost it to the bank. The original house was burned down in 1947 in a suspected arson fire. So I am all about a good mystery. You probably figured that out by now. I like all things mystery related. But it's been 184-ish years, and nobody has been able to figure out who killed this family. I mean, I know who I would think who did it. I mean, I would think the people who stood to get the money would do it, right? I mean, the wife was already gone, so infidelity was not an issue. He had too many fired farmhands to pinpoint one, unless they all ganged up on the whole family. But 145 witnesses and nobody could prove anything? That is so crazy. Tell me what you think. Leave me a comment and tell me what you think. There are photographs. These are the 4 people who were murdered in the home. And this is a photograph of the home they were murdered in. Thank you so much for stopping by my channel today. I hope you enjoyed our story. I have a couple other videos here that I think you might enjoy, as well as a subscribe button. If you have not yet subscribed to my channel, I would love it if you did. Leave me a comment, give me a thumbs up, and have a really fabulous day.